200 feet below the surface. That's where you are right now, and that's where 12 destroyers above you know you are, and that's where you're about to discover that being the hunter doesn't mean you can't become the prey. Because here's what they don't tell you about submarine warfare. The part that doesn't make it into the movies. The part that kept submariners awake during those rare moments when they weren't at battle stations. It's not about who has the bigger weapon. It's about who makes the first mistake. And in this game, mistakes are measured in seconds, and consequences are measured in lives. 40, 50, sometimes 80 lives, all depending on one man's decision, made in darkness, made in silence, made while death rains down from above at 10 feet per second. Let's do some math, shall we? A depth charge, that's a barrel packed with 300 pounds of high explosives, falls through water at roughly 10 feet per second. You're at 200 feet. That gives you 20 seconds from the moment it hits the water until it reaches your depth. 20 seconds. Sounds like plenty of time, right? Wrong. Because you don't know it's falling until it's already halfway down, and you can't move fast enough to get out of the kill radius. And even if you could, there are 11 more destroyers up there, and they're dropping charges in patterns, creating a grid of death that's designed specifically to eliminate the one advantage you thought you had: mobility. Welcome to the deadly game of cat and mouse. Except in this game, the mouse has torpedoes, and the cat has an entire fleet, and the ocean itself becomes a weapon that both sides use to kill each other in ways that would make surface warfare look merciful by comparison. This is the story of how submarines and destroyers hunted each other across every ocean of World War II. How men on both sides developed tactics that read like murder manuals, and how the mathematics of death became so precise that survival stopped being about luck and started being about who could calculate faster while their ship was being torn apart around them. Let's start with the basics, because you need to understand what these machines actually are before you can understand how they tried to kill each other. A World War II submarine, let's use a German Type 7 U-boat as our example, because they were the most common, the most deadly, and the most feared, is essentially a steel tube, 220 feet long, 20 feet wide, designed to do one thing extraordinarily well: sink ships while remaining invisible. On the surface, it can make 17 knots. That's about 20 miles per hour, fast enough to chase down merchant convoys, fast enough to escape if spotted early. But here's the catch that changes everything. Submerged, it can only make 7 knots, and it can only maintain that speed for 1 hour before the batteries die, and it has to surface. 1 hour. 60 minutes between you and helplessness. That's not a lot of time when someone's trying to kill you. Now let's talk about the hunter, the destroyer. A Fletcher-class destroyer, the American workhorse of the Pacific, is 376 feet of aggressive intent, capable of 36 knots on the surface, which means it's twice as fast as your submarine, even when you're running on the surface with your diesels screaming. And unlike you, it doesn't need to choose between speed and invisibility. It has both. Well, not invisibility, but when you're underwater and blind, except for what your hydrophones can hear, a destroyer doesn't need to hide. It just needs to find you. And finding you is exactly what it's designed to do. The destroyer carries something called sonar, ASDIC, the British called it, sound navigation and ranging, the Americans called it, and it works like this. The ship sends out a pulse of sound, an active ping that travels through the water at roughly 5,000 feet per second. And when that sound hits something solid, like your steel hull, it bounces back, and the operator measures the time delay and calculates your exact position. Ping, and they know where you are. But here's where it gets interesting, where the game becomes truly deadly. Submarines have hydrophones too, passive listening devices that can hear a destroyer's propellers from miles away, can identify the specific ship by the sound signature of its screws, can track its course and speed without ever revealing their own position. So you have a situation where both sides are trying to find each other, but the rules are completely different for each player. The destroyer can actively search using sonar, but every time it pings, it reveals its own position. The submarine can listen silently, perfectly hidden, but the moment it fires a torpedo, the moment it moves too fast, the moment anything on board makes noise, the destroyer's hydrophones pick it up. And then the depth charges start falling. Let me tell you about depth charges, because understanding them is understanding why submariners had a life expectancy measured in patrols, not years. A standard depth charge is a steel drum containing 300 pounds of TNT, or Torpex explosive. It's set to detonate at a specific depth, 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, whatever depth the destroyer captain thinks you're hiding at. And when it detonates, it doesn't need to hit you directly. Water doesn't compress. That's the key fact that makes depth charges so terrifying. When an explosion occurs underwater, the pressure wave doesn't dissipate the way it does in air. It travels farther, hits harder, and a depth charge that explodes 50 feet away from your hull hits with the same force as if someone swung a giant hammer into the side of your submarine. Rivets pop, pipes burst, electrical systems short out. Men are thrown across compartments, bones breaking against equipment. And if you're really unlucky, if the charge is close enough, if you're at the wrong depth, if the pressure wave hits at just the wrong angle, your hull splits open like a tin can, and the ocean comes in at a pressure of 88 pounds per square inch at 200 feet depth, and you have maybe 3 seconds to realize you're dying before the water pressure crushes your lungs. 3 seconds. That's all the time you get to understand that you lost the game. But submariners aren't helpless. They have tactics, strategies developed through experience, and experience means watching other boats go down, learning from their mistakes, figuring out what works through the process of elimination, where elimination is literal. First tactic, go deep. Every submarine has a maximum operational depth. For a Type 7 U-boat, that's officially 750 feet, though some desperate captains push to 900 feet and live to tell about it. The deeper you go, the more water pressure you have to survive, but also the more water between you and those depth charges. And sound travels weird at different depths, creating thermal layers that can hide you from sonar. Second tactic, go silent. Silent running, they called it. Engines off, fans off, every piece of machinery that makes noise gets shut down. Men move in socks or barefoot. Whispered communications only. Even breathing quietly becomes a trained skill, because the hydrophone operators on those destroyers above you are wearing headphones, listening for any sound, a dropped wrench, a cough, a pump cycling, that tells them exactly where you are. And in that silence, you wait. You wait while the oxygen slowly depletes, while the carbon dioxide builds up, while the temperature rises because the air conditioning is off, while depth charges explode around you, sometimes close enough to throw you off your feet, sometimes distant thunder, but always, always counting them, because you know each destroyer carries between 30 and 60 depth charges, and when they run out, you might survive. Third tactic, the bold one, the desperate one, the one that requires nerves made of something harder than steel. Turn toward the attacker. Because here's the mathematical beauty of it. Sonar has a blind spot. Directly beneath the destroyer, there's a cone of silence where the sonar can't detect you, where you're invisible not because you're far away, but because you're too close. And if you can get into that blind spot, if you can position yourself directly under the destroyer's hull, you become unfindable. And the destroyer can't drop depth charges without potentially damaging itself. Of course, getting into that blind spot means driving your submarine directly toward the ship that's trying to kill you, maintaining perfect depth control while depth charges explode around you, and somehow timing it so you slide under the destroyer at the exact moment its sonar sweep passes over your position. Simple, right? And this brings us to the human element, the part that no amount of technical specification can capture. The men who fought this war. On the submarine, you have 40 to 50 men living in a space smaller than most people's houses, sharing bunks in rotation because there aren't enough beds for the full crew, breathing air that smells like diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, and fear, eating food from cans because there's no refrigeration after the first week, and knowing, absolutely knowing, that if anything goes wrong at depth, there is no rescue, no escape, only the choice between drowning quickly or drowning slowly while your air runs out. The silent service they called the submarine force. And silent didn't just refer to how they operated, it referred to how they died. Because when a submarine went down, it often went down with no witnesses, no survivors, no final radio message, just missing, presumed lost. And the families back home got a telegram that said their husband, their father, their son was gone, and there wasn't even a body to bury. The statistics are brutal. The U.S. Navy submarine service had a 22% fatality rate. 1 in 5 submariners died. The German U-boat force had it worse, 75% casualty rate by the end of the war. 3 out of 4 U-boat crew members either died or were captured. And yet men volunteered. They volunteered because submarine service paid more, because it offered faster promotion, because it was considered an elite posting where skill mattered more than seniority. They volunteered knowing the odds, and they went to sea anyway. Now that you understand the machines and the men, let's talk about how the actual hunt works, because this is where theory becomes terror, where calculations become life or death decisions made in darkness, while explosions walk closer to your position. Let's put you in this scenario. It's 0300 hours, 3 in the morning, and you're the captain of a Type 7 U-boat patrolling the North Atlantic convoy routes. Your hydrophone operator reports propeller sounds bearing 045, range estimated at 12 miles. Multiple contacts, which means a convoy. Merchant ships carrying supplies, exactly what you're here to sink. But where there are merchant ships, there are escorts, destroyers, corvettes, frigates, ships whose sole purpose is to find submarines like yours and kill them before you can reach the convoy. You make your decision, surface attack. You'll run on the surface using your diesel engines, 17 knots, fast enough to get ahead of the convoy, position yourself along their projected course, then submerge and wait for them to come to you. It's the classic tactic, the one that sunk thousands of tons of Allied shipping. But tonight, someone's hunting you back. The destroyer HMS Watcher, a British W-class destroyer with an experienced captain and a crew that's been hunting U-boats for 2 years, is running with radar turned on, sweeping the ocean surface every few seconds, looking for exactly what you're about to do. And at 0327 hours, their radar operator sees it. A contact, small, low profile, moving at 17 knots. It's you, and you don't even know they've found you yet because your submarine doesn't have radar detection equipment. That technology is still months away from deployment. The destroyer turns toward you, increases speed to 30 knots, and starts closing the distance. They're 8 miles away. At their current speed, they'll reach you in 16 minutes. At 0334, 7 minutes into their pursuit, your bridge watch spots them. A dark shape on the horizon, closing fast, and there's no question what it is. You have seconds to make a decision that will determine whether your crew lives or dies. Surface fight? Your deck gun versus their 5-inch guns? That's not a fight, that's suicide. Their guns have longer range, faster rate of fire, and you're low in the water, making you hard to hit. But one lucky shot into your pressure hull and you're going down anyway. Run on the surface? They're faster than you. They'll catch you in 10 minutes, maybe less. No, there's only one option. Dive. Dive now, crash dive, get underwater before they get close enough to see exactly where you went down. Because the faster you dive, the bigger the search area they have to cover with their sonar. Alarm! Dive! 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 The klaxon sounds, that harsh awooga awooga that every submariner hears in nightmares for the rest of their life, and everything becomes controlled chaos. Bridge watch drops through the hatch, sealing it behind them. Vents open, letting seawater flood into ballast tanks. The bow planes angle down, stern planes angle down, and the submarine starts dropping. 60 seconds from surface to periscope depth, 60 feet down. Another 60 seconds to 120 feet. You want to be at 200 feet, deep enough that you're below the thermal layer, deep enough that sonar has trouble finding you, but shallow enough that you're not using up your battery capacity, just maintaining depth. But the destroyer captain knows what you're doing. He saw you dive, marked the position, and now he's racing toward that spot at 30 knots because he needs to get there while you're still shallow, still vulnerable, before you can disappear into the deep. At 0337, the destroyer reaches your dive position. Their sonar operator goes active, sends out a ping. Ping. Inside your submarine, you hear it. A sharp, metallic sound that travels through the hull. A sound that means they know where you are. They have a firing solution, and the depth charges are about to start falling. Your hydrophone operator reports splashes, multiple splashes, bearing constant. That means depth charges hitting the water directly overhead. That means you have 20 seconds before they reach your depth. All ahead full, right full rudder, take her down to 300 feet. You're trying to move, trying to get out of the pattern, because destroyers don't drop depth charges randomly. They drop them in calculated patterns, creating overlapping kill zones based on where they think you're going. And right now, they think you're going to do the obvious thing. Dive deep and run fast. Which is exactly what you're doing. The first depth charge detonates at 200 feet, 100 feet above you. Wham! The submarine lurches, throwing men against equipment. Light bulbs shatter. Cork insulation rains down from the ceiling. Someone screams in the aft torpedo room where a valve has broken and seawater is spraying in a high-pressure jet. But the hull holds. The submarine is still diving, still maneuvering, still alive. And then the second charge goes off. This one's closer, maybe 70 feet away, and at this depth, that's close enough. Wham! The lights go out, complete darkness except for emergency lighting that casts everything in red. The depth gauge needle is spinning. You're falling fast now, out of control, because the diving planes aren't responding, which means either the hydraulics are gone or the operators are injured, or both. 350 feet. 400 feet. 450 feet. You're past your maximum operational depth, and the hull is groaning. A sound like a living thing in pain, the sound of steel being compressed by water pressure that increases by ½ pound per square inch for every foot you descend. Blow forward tanks, emergency surface, emergency surface. But surfacing means coming up right underneath that destroyer, and surfacing means exposing yourself to their deck guns. And surfacing means admitting you've lost, you've been beaten, and now all you can do is try to save your crew by surrendering before the submarine implodes from depth pressure or drowns everyone aboard when the pressure hull fails. Except you don't surface, because at 480 feet, the diving planes suddenly respond. Someone in the control room has managed to switch to manual operation, physically cranking the planes to level position, and the submarine starts to stabilize. You're at 490 feet. The pressure is so intense that every rivet in the hull is being tested. Every weld is being stressed beyond its design specification, and you can hear water trickling somewhere in the dark. Not a spray, just a trickle, which means a small leak, which means the hull has been compromised, but not catastrophically. Not yet. And now you make the decision that might save you or might kill you. You maintain depth. You stay at 490 feet, deeper than any submarine is supposed to operate, because up there at 200 feet, that destroyer is still dropping depth charges, still searching, and down here you're below where they expect you to be, below where their depth charges are set to explode. You're gambling that your hull can take the pressure long enough for the destroyer to give up the search. You're gambling that the leak doesn't get worse. You're gambling that your batteries have enough power to maintain position, because if you lose power at this depth, you sink to the bottom and you never come back up. And in the darkness, in the silence of ultra-quiet running, with engines off and men barely breathing, you wait. You wait while depth charges explode above you, counting them, 60, 70, 80 explosions, each one a hammer blow that makes the hull ring like a bell. You wait while the oxygen gets thin and the carbon dioxide builds up, and men start gasping because there's not enough air. You wait for 1 hour, then 2 hours, then 3 hours while the battery gauge drops and drops and drops, and you know that when it hits zero, you have to surface whether the destroyer is still up there or not. And then, silence. The depth charges have stopped. The hydrophone operator reports no contacts, no propeller sounds, nothing. Either the destroyer has left, or it's sitting up there, silent, waiting for you to make a sound, waiting for you to move, waiting for you to think you've survived so it can start the attack all over again. What you just experienced, that hunt, that near-death encounter, that was the standard engagement between submarines and destroyers early in the war. But both sides learned, adapted, evolved their tactics, and the game became more sophisticated and more deadly with every passing month. Let's talk about how destroyers hunted submarines, because it's not as simple as find them and drop depth charges. It's a science, a deadly mathematics that destroyer captains studied and refined until they could predict submarine behavior with terrifying accuracy. First, understand the hunter-killer group tactic. Early in the war, convoys had maybe 1 or 2 escorts, not enough to both protect the merchant ships and actively hunt submarines. But by 1943, the Allies had developed a system where the convoy would have close escorts that stayed with the merchant ships, and separate hunter-killer groups, usually 4 to 6 destroyers working together, whose only job was to find submarines and sink them. Here's how it worked. When a submarine was detected, either by radar on the surface or by sonar when submerged, the hunter-killer group would form up in a specific pattern. Think of it like a net closing around a fish. Ship 1 maintains sonar contact, tracks your position constantly, pinging every few seconds to update your location. Ship 2 moves to your estimated future position based on your last known course and speed, cutting off your escape route. Ship 3 circles wide, listening on passive sonar for any sound you make when you try to evade. Ship 4 stands by as the killer. It's the one that will make the actual depth charge attack once the others have you pinned. And from your perspective in the submarine, it's psychological warfare. You can hear multiple propeller sounds on the hydrophones, coming from different directions, and you can't tell which one is tracking you and which one is guessing, and you can't surface to see where they are, and you can't stay deep forever because your battery is dying. You're being hunted by a coordinated pack, and they have time on their side, and oxygen on their side, and fuel on their side, and all you have is the hope that they'll make a mistake before you run out of options. But submarines developed counter-tactics. Let me tell you about the bold canister, one of the most clever devices of the entire war. It's a metal cylinder about the size of a fire extinguisher, filled with calcium hydride. When you eject it from the submarine through a special launcher, it sinks slowly, and as it sinks, the calcium hydride reacts with seawater to create hydrogen bubbles. Thousands and thousands of tiny bubbles that create a massive cloud in the water. And here's the beautiful part. To sonar, that bubble cloud looks exactly like a submarine. The destroyer's sonar pings bounce back from the bubbles. The operator sees a solid contact, and the destroyer attacks the bubble cloud with depth charges, while you, the actual submarine, slip away in a different direction. German U-boats carried dozens of bold canisters by late in the war, and they used them with devastating effectiveness. Allied destroyer captains learned to distrust sonar contacts, to verify them visually when possible. But in the heat of combat with multiple submarines in the area, that bubble cloud bought precious minutes of escape time. And then there's the bottom-sitting tactic. In shallow waters, the English Channel, the North Sea, the Baltic, some submarine captains discovered that if the ocean floor was relatively flat, they could actually land their submarine on the bottom, shut down everything, and become essentially invisible. Sonar can't distinguish a submarine from the seabed if it's not moving, and the hydrophones can't hear you if you're not running machinery. So you sit there, on the bottom at 200 or 300 feet depth, and you wait for the destroyers to give up and leave. Of course, the problem is that you're committed. If they don't leave, if they decide to saturate the area with depth charges, you can't maneuver, can't dodge, can't do anything except sit there and take it while explosions walk across the seabed toward your position. And if a depth charge lands close enough, the shock wave can actually lift your submarine off the bottom and throw it sideways, smashing it into underwater terrain, breaking the hull open. But the most terrifying destroyer tactic, the one that submariners feared more than anything else, was the creeping attack. Here's how it works. Once the destroyers have you localized to a specific area, one ship maintains sonar contact from a distance, maybe 2 miles away, too far for you to hear its propellers clearly. Meanwhile, another destroyer shuts down its engines and just drifts. Silent. Invisible to your hydrophones. The distant destroyer keeps pinging, keeps tracking you, and it's feeding targeting information to the silent destroyer through signal lights or radio. And that silent destroyer is drifting closer to you, carried by wind and current, until it's directly above your position. And then it drops a full pattern of depth charges all at once. And the first indication you have that it's there is when the charges hit the water. And by then it's too late to maneuver, too late to escape, too late to do anything except brace for impact and hope your hull can take what's about to happen. The creeping attack killed dozens of submarines because it eliminated the one warning system submariners relied on, the sound of approaching propellers. No propeller noise meant no warning, and no warning meant no chance to evade. But submarines adapted even to this. Some captains learned to listen for the distant destroyer and plot its position, then calculate backward to estimate where the silent drifter might be. Others used the bold canisters more aggressively, creating multiple false targets so the destroyers couldn't tell which sonar contact was real. And then there was the most aggressive counter tactic of all, turning and attacking the hunters. Because here's what most people don't realize about submarine warfare. Submarines weren't just commerce raiders attacking merchant ships. They also hunted warships, including the destroyers that hunted them. And a destroyer is just as vulnerable to a torpedo as a merchant vessel. More vulnerable, actually, because destroyers have thinner armor and higher speed means more water rushing into a torpedo hole. But attacking a destroyer requires perfect timing and ice-cold nerves. You have to let the destroyer get close enough for a reliable torpedo shot, maybe 1,000 yards, which in submarine warfare is knife fighting range. You have to track its course and speed using only sound, without ever raising your periscope because that might give away your position. You have to fire your torpedo and then immediately go deep, because the torpedo wake is going to tell that destroyer exactly where you are. And here's the terrible mathematics of it. A torpedo takes 45 seconds to cover 1,000 yards at its running speed of 46 knots. The destroyer, once it sees the torpedo wake, has 45 seconds to react, to turn, to accelerate, to avoid the hit. And if your torpedo misses, that destroyer is going to be very, very angry. and it knows exactly where you are, and it's going to turn around and come back and drop so many depth charges that the ocean itself feels like it's exploding. But when it worked, when the torpedo hit, it was the ultimate reversal. The hunter becomes the prey, and suddenly that destroyer that was tracking you, that was calling in reinforcements, that was coordinating the attack, suddenly it's the one struggling to stay afloat, and you're the one slipping away into the deep. And that's exactly what happened on July 12, 1943, when U-boat U-134, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Rudolf Schendel, was being hunted by 4 British destroyers in the Bay of Biscay. They had him pinned. 4 destroyers working in coordination, pinging constantly, dropping depth charges in patterns, pushing him deeper and deeper until his hull was groaning from the pressure. His battery was at 15%. His oxygen was thin enough that men were gasping. And he absolutely knew, that if he surfaced to recharge his batteries and get fresh air, those 4 destroyers would sink him with gunfire in minutes. So he did the impossible thing. He turned toward the nearest destroyer, HMS Wanderer, and fired a full spread of 4 torpedoes at point-blank range, 1,000 yards. 45 seconds of flight time. The hydrophone operator could hear the torpedoes running, could hear them tracking toward the target, could hear the sudden sound of Wanderer's propellers accelerating as the destroyer tried to evade. And then, boom! Torpedo hit, amidships, catastrophic explosion. HMS Wanderer broke in half and sank in 4 minutes, taking most of its crew with it. And U-134? While the other 3 destroyers were rescuing survivors and trying to understand what had just happened, Schendel took his submarine deep and slipped away. He surfaced 10 miles away 3 hours later, recharged his batteries, and made it back to port. The hunter had become the prey and then became the hunter again. That's the deadly game they played. But let's be honest about how most of these encounters ended, because the story of U-134 is the exception, not the rule. For every submarine that escaped, for every clever tactic that worked, there were 10 submarines that went down with all hands, and the men aboard never knew what hit them, or worse, they knew exactly what was happening and could do nothing to stop it. Let me take you into those final minutes, the moment when a submarine crew realizes they're not going to survive, when all the training and tactics and clever equipment come down to the simple, terrible fact that the ocean is coming in and there's no way to stop it. You're at 300 feet depth. A depth charge has just exploded 50 feet from your hull, close enough that the pressure wave has cracked one of the main seawater piping seals. It's not a catastrophic failure, not yet, but water is coming in under high pressure, spraying across the engine room, and you have maybe 3 minutes before the electrical systems short out from the water contact. The captain orders emergency surface. This is the last-ditch option, the admission that you've lost the underwater battle, and your only chance now is to get to the surface, open the hatches, and let the crew abandon ship before the submarine sinks. Compressed air blows into the ballast tanks, forcing water out, giving you buoyancy. The submarine starts rising, slowly at first, then faster as more air displaces more water. 250 feet, 200 feet, 150 feet, and on the surface, the destroyer captain sees it, the swirl of water that indicates something large is coming up from the deep. His crew is already at battle stations, deck guns loaded and trained on that disturbed water. 100 feet, 50 feet, and then the submarine breaches, breaks the surface like a whale coming up for air, water streaming off its hull, conning tower appearing first, then the deck, then the whole length of the boat visible in the daylight. The hatch opens. The captain and bridge watch start coming up, gasping for fresh air after hours breathing the stale, contaminated atmosphere below. And that's when the destroyer opens fire. 5-inch guns firing at a range of 800 yards. You can't miss at that range. The first shell hits the conning tower, exploding in a shower of shrapnel that kills everyone on the bridge instantly. The second shell penetrates the pressure hull forward of the conning tower, exploding inside the submarine, inside the control room where men are still trying to organize an evacuation. And inside is chaos. Men screaming, men on fire from the shell explosion, men trying to reach the hatches that are now blocked by wreckage. The submarine is flooding fast now, not from one leak, but from multiple hull breaches. And it's going down stern first because the aft torpedo room is already completely flooded. You have maybe 60 seconds before the submarine sinks back below the surface. 60 seconds to get out through the hatches, to get into the water, to get far enough away that you won't be sucked down when the submarine makes its final dive. Some men make it. They claw their way up through the conning tower hatch or the forward hatch, jump into the ocean, swim frantically away from the dying submarine. But more don't make it. They're trapped below when the hatches slam shut from the water pressure, or they're injured and can't move fast enough, or they make it to the hatch but the submarine is already going under and the inrush of water pushes them back down. And then the submarine sinks. It tilts stern down, slides backward into the dark water, picks up speed as it falls, and you can hear it even from the surface. The sound of metal groaning, of bulkheads collapsing under pressure, of a steel coffin falling toward the bottom, carrying men who are still alive, still breathing the last pockets of air, still knowing they have maybe 90 seconds before the hull collapses completely or the air runs out. 90 seconds to understand that you're going to die in the dark, in the cold, in a broken metal tube at the bottom of the ocean, and nobody will ever find your body, and your family will never know exactly how it happened. But let's also talk about what happens to the survivors, the men who made it into the water. Because survival in cold ocean water is its own kind of hell. The North Atlantic in winter is 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold enough to kill you through hypothermia in 30 minutes if you're not wearing protective gear. And submariners don't wear survival suits. They wear regular uniforms, maybe a life jacket if they grabbed one on the way out. The first 5 minutes are the worst because your body goes into cold shock, involuntary gasping, hyperventilation, elevated heart rate. If you're unlucky, you inhale water during that gasping phase, and you drown without ever having a chance to swim. If you're lucky, you get past the cold shock and enter stage 2. Stage 2 is where your muscles stop working properly. Your hands become useless. You can't grip anything, can't fasten a life jacket properly if you're trying to put one on, can't even hold on to wreckage to keep yourself afloat. Your swimming becomes uncoordinated because your muscles are firing randomly, and you're using up energy fast. And using up energy means generating heat, and you don't have heat to spare. And then comes stage 3, where you stop shivering because your body has given up on trying to generate warmth, and you start feeling sleepy. And the water doesn't feel cold anymore. It feels almost comfortable, almost warm, and that's when you know you're dying because the warmth is your brain shutting down from hypothermia. The destroyer might pick up survivors. Might. Depends on whether there are other submarines in the area that might attack while the destroyer is stopped and vulnerable. Depends on whether the destroyer captain feels merciful or whether he's lost friends to submarine attacks and wants revenge. Depends on pure luck, whether you're spotted in the water, whether you have enough strength left to wave and signal, whether the destroyer has room aboard for prisoners. And if they don't pick you up, then you float there, in your life jacket, watching the destroyer steam away, and you have 30 minutes or maybe an hour if you're very strong, and then you slip underwater and you're gone. This is what happened to U-175 on April 17, 1943. Hunted by the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Spencer, depth charged to the surface, forced to abandon ship. 13 men killed in the deck gun battle when they tried to man their weapons. The submarine scuttled by its own crew to prevent capture. And then, Then the really terrible part. There were 54 men in the water. The Spencer picked up 41. That means 13 men were left behind, floating in the North Atlantic in April. Water temperature maybe 45 degrees, and the Spencer steamed away because there were reports of other U-boats in the area, and the captain wasn't going to risk his ship to search for more survivors. Those 13 men, they had maybe an hour, maybe less, and they spent that hour watching their submarine's final position marked by an oil slick and debris, watching the horizon where the Spencer had disappeared, and knowing that nobody was coming back. And this is the part that doesn't make it into the heroic narratives about submarine warfare, the part that gets glossed over in the statistics. Both sides did this. Allied destroyers left German submariners to die in the water. German U-boats left Allied merchant sailors to die in the water after torpedoing their ships. Because in the mathematics of survival, in the cold calculation of war, picking up survivors means making yourself vulnerable, means slowing down, means potentially losing your own ship and your own crew to save the enemy. And most captains, most men, chose their own crew's survival over the enemy's humanity. But not all of them. Let me tell you about one exception, one moment of humanity in the middle of this deadly game, because it's important to remember that even in war, even when men are trying to kill each other, sometimes someone makes the choice to be better than the situation demands. October 12, 1943. The British submarine HMS Tribune torpedoes and sinks the German merchant ship Chemnitz in the Baltic Sea. Normal submarine tactics say you submerge immediately after the attack, get away from the area before escorts arrive. But Tribune's captain, Lieutenant Commander G.S. Salt, surfaces and approaches the survivors in the water. This is insanely dangerous. He's in enemy waters. He's just announced his position by sinking a ship, and German patrol boats are probably already responding to the distress call. Every second he stays on the surface increases the chance that he'll be caught and sunk. But he does it anyway. Tribune's crew pulls 32 German merchant sailors out of the water, gives them blankets and hot tea, treats their injuries. And then, because they're still in enemy waters and can't take prisoners back to base, Salt makes a decision that could have gotten him court-martialed. He surfaces near the Swedish coast, within Sweden's territorial waters where his submarine technically isn't supposed to operate, and he puts the German survivors into life rafts with enough supplies to reach shore. They drift to Swedish beaches within hours, interned by neutral Sweden, but alive. Salt's report to his superiors simply states, "Recovered survivors from merchant vessel. Release them in neutral waters per regulations regarding non-combatants." He got a reprimand for violating Swedish territorial waters. He didn't get a court-martial because the survivors were merchant sailors, not military personnel, and there was technically a legal argument for treating them as non-combatants. But what that report doesn't say, what Salt never officially reported, is that he knew damn well those men would have died if he'd followed standard procedure. The Baltic in October is cold enough to kill in 30 minutes. He saved them because he chose to, knowing the risk, knowing the potential consequences, choosing humanity over tactics. That's the exception, the statistical outlier. For every Lieutenant Commander Salt, there were 100 other captains who made the mathematically sound decision, the tactically correct decision, the decision that kept their own crews alive by leaving the enemy to die. And that's the real story of submarine warfare, not just the tactics and the technology and the dramatic battles, but the impossible moral choices that men had to make in situations where there was no good answer, where every decision meant someone was going to die, and the only question was whether it would be your men or theirs. So what happens after? What happens to the men who survived this deadly game, who played cat and mouse with death in the dark waters of the Atlantic and Pacific and lived to tell about it? They came home changed. Let's talk about the statistics first, because numbers tell part of the story. The U.S. Navy submarine force lost 52 boats during World War II, and 3,505 men, 374 officers, and 3,131 enlisted. That's a 22% fatality rate, the highest of any American military branch in the war. The Germans had it worse. Of the 1,156 U-boats commissioned during the war, 784 were sunk. That's a 68% loss rate. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force, around 30,000 died, and another 5,000 were captured. That's a 75% casualty rate. 3 out of 4 men who went to sea in a U-boat never came home, or came home as prisoners of war. Think about that for a moment. Imagine joining a military service where you have a 75% chance of dying or being captured. Imagine looking around your submarine at the 49 other faces of your crew and knowing, statistically knowing, that 37 of you won't survive the war. And yet they volunteered. They kept going back out on patrol, kept diving into the dark water, kept hunting and being hunted, because that was the job, because their country told them it was necessary, because submarines were sinking thousands of tons of Allied shipping and someone had to crew them. But the psychological cost, the cost that doesn't show up in casualty statistics, that was enormous. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a recognized diagnosis during World War II. They called it shell shock, or combat fatigue, or sometimes just nerves, and the treatment was usually sending men back to duty as soon as possible, because there was a war to fight and sympathy was a luxury the military couldn't afford. But submarine veterans came home with what we now recognize as severe PTSD at rates higher than almost any other combat veterans. The underwater environment, the constant threat, the inability to escape, the sounds of depth charges, the memory of friends dying in the dark, these things left psychological scars that lasted decades. Interviews with submarine veterans from the 1980s and 1990s, men in their 60s and 70s, 50 years after the war, reveal consistent patterns. They couldn't sleep in closed rooms. They couldn't tolerate loud noises, especially metallic banging sounds. They had panic attacks in enclosed spaces. They woke up gasping, convinced they were drowning. One veteran, a former sonar operator on USS Silversides, said in a 1987 interview, "I still hear the pings. 50 years later, I still hear them. Sometimes I'm in a grocery store and a cart squeaks and suddenly I'm back in that submarine, depth charges falling, and I have to leave, have to get outside where I can breathe." And that's a veteran who survived, whose submarine made it through the war intact. Imagine the psychological burden carried by survivors of submarines that were sunk, men who escaped through flooded compartments, who floated in freezing water waiting for rescue, who watched their friends die. But there's another side to this legacy, the technological and tactical side. And it's worth understanding because the lessons learned from World War II submarine warfare shaped everything that came after. Modern submarine tactics are directly descended from the cat-and-mouse game that submariners and destroyer crews perfected between 1939 and 1945. The concepts of silent running, thermal layer exploitation, decoy deployment, even the idea of hunter-killer groups, all of these were developed during World War II and are still used by submarine forces today. Modern sonar technology is exponentially more sophisticated than World War II ASDIC, but the fundamental principles are identical. Send out a pulse, measure the return, calculate target position. Modern submarines are nuclear-powered and can stay submerged for months instead of hours, but they still use the same evasion tactics, going deep, finding thermal layers, using terrain to mask their position. And the psychological warfare aspect, the battle of nerves between hunter and hunted, that hasn't changed at all. Modern submarine commanders study the same scenarios that World War II captains faced: when to stay silent, when to evade, when to attack, how to read the enemy's intentions from fragmentary sonar data. There's a training exercise that modern submarine forces still use called tracking and evading, where submarines practice hunting each other in a simulated combat environment. The tactics used in these exercises, approaching from below using terrain masking, creating false signatures, maintaining absolute silence during the final approach, these are the same tactics that successful World War II submarine captains used. Because the fundamental challenge hasn't changed. How do you hunt something you can't see in an environment where sound is your only sense, and every action you take might give away your position? Let's talk about specific innovations that came from World War II submarine warfare and are still relevant today. First, decoy technology. The bold canisters that German U-boats used evolved into modern acoustic decoys that submarines can launch to create false signatures. Modern versions are more sophisticated. They can mimic a submarine's acoustic signature exactly, create false Doppler shifts to simulate movement, even deploy multiple decoys in sequence to create the illusion of a submarine zigzagging to evade. Second, multi-layered defense. The hunter-killer group concept, multiple surface ships working together to trap a submarine, that evolved into modern anti-submarine warfare task forces that include surface ships, helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft, all coordinating to track and engage underwater targets. The technology is different, but the concept is identical to what British and American destroyer groups were doing in 1943. Third, the importance of intelligence and pattern recognition. World War II destroyer captains learned to predict submarine behavior based on previous encounters, learned to recognize the acoustic signatures of specific U-boats, learned where submarines were likely to be based on convoy routes and ocean conditions. Modern anti-submarine warfare relies even more heavily on this kind of intelligence, tracking submarine deployments, identifying unique acoustic signatures, predicting patrol patterns based on strategic objectives. But perhaps the most important legacy is the understanding of what submarine warfare costs psychologically. Modern submarine forces recognize that you can't just train men technically and send them into the deep for months at a time. You have to select for psychological resilience, monitor mental health constantly, provide decompression time between patrols, and accept that even with all those precautions, submarine service will take a psychological toll. The U.S. Navy's submarine force today has mandatory psychological screening, regular mental health check-ins during patrols, and comprehensive support programs for veterans. They learned from World War II that you can't ignore the mental health cost of sending men into an environment where they're isolated, under constant pressure, and aware that any mistake could kill everyone aboard. Those lessons came at the cost of thousands of men who came home broken, who struggled for decades with trauma that nobody understood or treated properly, who lived with nightmares and panic attacks and survivor's guilt for the rest of their lives. There's a memorial at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut. It lists the names of every U.S. submarine lost during World War II and every man who died aboard them. 3,505 names. If you stand there and try to read every name, it takes about 40 minutes, and by the end your voice is hoarse from reading, and your eyes are tired, and you start to understand, just barely start to understand, the scale of the loss. And that's just the American losses. The German U-boat memorial in Moltenort lists over 30,000 names. The British submarine memorial lists another 5,300. The Japanese, the Italians, the Russians. Every nation that fought the war lost submariners, and every one of those losses was someone's son, someone's father, someone's husband who went down into the dark water and never came back up. But here's what else that memorial represents. The men who are remembered there changed naval warfare forever. They proved that submarines could be decisive strategic weapons, not just nuisance raiders. They developed tactics that are still taught in naval academies today. They fought a war that was as much about mathematics and psychology as it was about weapons and machinery. American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese ships during World War II. That's about 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war. They cut off Japan's supply lines, starved the Japanese war machine of oil and raw materials, and made it impossible for Japan to sustain its military operations. The submarine blockade of Japan was arguably as important as the atomic bombs in forcing Japanese surrender. German U-boats sank 2,775 Allied merchant ships and 175 Allied warships. They came close, terrifyingly close, to cutting Britain off from American supplies and winning the Battle of the Atlantic. If they had succeeded, if they had sunk enough ships to make the convoy system collapse, D-Day might never have happened because there would have been no way to build up sufficient supplies in Britain for the invasion. Both sides played the deadly game of cat and mouse, and both sides paid the price. The difference was that the Allies learned faster, adapted better, and had the industrial capacity to build more destroyers and escort vessels faster than the U-boats could sink them. By 1943, the Allies were building ships faster than they were losing them. By 1944, the U-boat force was effectively defeated, still dangerous, still sinking ships, but no longer capable of winning the Battle of the Atlantic. And by 1945, U-boat captains were being sent on what they knew were suicide missions, ordered to sea in boats that had almost no chance of survival, because the German High Command refused to admit the submarine war was lost. The last U-boat sunk in combat was U-320, destroyed on April 30, 1945, the same day Hitler committed suicide. The last U-boat to surrender was U-234, which surfaced off the coast of New England on May 14, 1945, 6 days after Germany's unconditional surrender. And when those final U-boats surfaced and their crews came up into the sunlight, many of them hadn't seen daylight in weeks. They were pale, malnourished, exhausted, and they were the lucky ones, because they survived when 30,000 of their comrades didn't. So let's come back to where we started. 200 feet below the surface, 12 destroyers hunting you, depth charges falling at 10 feet per second, and 20 seconds between life and death. Now you understand what that really means. Now you understand that it's not just about the technology or the tactics. It's about the men who had to make impossible decisions in situations where every option led to someone dying, where survival was part skill and part mathematics, and part sheer blind luck. The deadly game of cat and mouse between submarines and destroyers wasn't won by either side. It was survived by the men who played it and learned its rules through trial and error, where error meant their ships sinking and their crew drowning in the dark. Those men, American, British, German, Japanese, all of them, they were hunters and prey simultaneously, predators who could become victims in seconds, and they lived with that reality every moment they were at sea. 3,505 American submariners died. 30,000 German U-boat crew members died. Thousands more British, Japanese, Italian, and Soviet submariners died. And thousands of destroyer crew members died hunting them. Most of them have no graves, just names on memorials, just entries in casualty lists, just memories held by families who never got to bury their dead because the ocean doesn't give back its casualties. But their legacy, what they learned, what they proved, what they sacrificed, that shaped everything that came after. Modern submarine warfare, modern anti-submarine tactics, modern naval strategy, all of it built on lessons paid for in blood and written in the dark water of every ocean where this deadly game was played. So the next time you see a submarine surface, or watch a documentary about naval warfare, or read about modern military technology, remember, someone figured out those tactics by trial and error. Someone learned those lessons the hard way. Someone died so that future generations would know what works and what doesn't when you're 200 feet down and the destroyers know where you are. The hunter becomes the prey. The prey becomes the hunter. And in the end, the ocean takes them both. Remember them. Remember the deadly game they played. Remember that courage and terror aren't opposites. They're partners in the dark water, 200 feet down, where the depth charges fall, and the only question is whether you'll hear the next one coming.